Okay, now we're recording. Good.
Wonderful. Are you seeing just like my slide screen, or have you got like the notes version of the PowerPoint?
I see just your slide.
Excellent. That's good. There's no notes to see, but if there was. All right. So as Mr. Davis said, my name is Jasmin McInerney. I actually live in a town called Davis in California. I am an ocean engineer and kind of a climate scientist. And as you've probably learned already, climate science is a really, really, really big thing with lots of elements. And so I do pieces of that. And I'm going to talk today a bit about what an ocean engineer is and how I became an ocean engineer and how I do ocean engineering to study the climate and a bit more specifically about what I do. So one of the main things that I do is I use autonomous underwater robots to collect data. And yeah, all right. Okay, so I'm from Australia, as I mentioned earlier. I grew up near the ocean, so this beach scene in the background there is what I would usually do on a Saturday. And I really loved the ocean and all things ocean. And then someone came to my school when I was in high school and talked about becoming an ocean engineer. And I thought, ooh, I like doing math and I like doing science, and I sort of was already interested in engineering, but I couldn't choose what kind. So if you decide you want to be an engineer, you'll have to pick what kind of engineering you want to study, because there's lots of different things you can do. And so after hearing about what ocean engineers do, so they work on things that go in the ocean, I was like, yep, I love the ocean, want to do engineering, let me go do that. And so I went to the Australian Maritime College, which is in Tasmania, so the tiny island off of the bottom of Australia, and that's where that is. And I spent 4 years there, and I studied, and I did pretty well. And then I became what we call a maritime engineer. So it's a little bit more general than ocean engineering. So I went out and I got a real job. And then I worked for a little while in Sydney, Australia, being a maritime engineer. And then, so while I was doing my first degree at the Australian Maritime College, the professor I was working for, so we have to do a research project. So you spend all year working for one professor, as well as doing a couple of classes. And he said to me, I'm moving to California. You should come and do a PhD. And I said, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I'm good enough to do that. And he said to me, you are. And I was still a little bit skeptical, but I thought about it. And then I was like, yeah, you know what? I could do that. But I kind of wanted to go out and get a real job. And so that's what I did. I went and got a real job, and I lasted 6 months before I got bored. And then I called up the professor that I currently work for, who was in Australia and has now moved over to California, and I said, yep, I'll do it. And then I filled out a bunch of paperwork and went and got a visa. I'm sure you guys have all been through the visa getting process for different places. And then I ended up in California. So I call myself a PhD candidate. What that means is I passed a really tricky exam that's sort of like a really, really, really hard job interview. And that means that a bunch of people who were the professors and the experts in the field signed off to say that I could too be an expert when I finished doing my work. So that's great. It's a great start. And I've always also been interested in all kinds of water activities. I'm a water person, so whitewater rafting, diving, surfing, sailing, all of these things. But a bunch of these things I didn't really get into until I grew up. So whitewater rafting is probably one of those, and so scuba diving, I didn't start doing that until I was in my 20s. So it's never too late to learn something, and you don't have to be scared of it. And like surfing, my mom didn't learn to surf until she was 40 years old, and she's definitely still better than me. So you're never too old to learn something new. All right. So what do? I study how water moves in lakes and oceans, and I do that to better understand how it affects structures. And so things like in Australia, we have a bunch of these ocean pools. So we build a swimming pool right by the ocean and all the waves crash over the edge of it, and we need to make sure that it's strong enough so that when the waves hit it, it doesn't fall down. Also, so I designed one of those during my undergraduate degree, and the town that I'm from is currently trying to build one, which is really exciting. They took my first design and they've changed it a lot since then, but it was certainly helped them get some money to move on to the next stage of that. So that's exciting. And then, so we're also interested in pipelines. So you can see down the bottom in the middle there, there's a subsea pipeline and it's got all of this stuff that's grown over the top of it. And you can see underneath it, all of the sand has washed away. That's a big problem because it was not designed to have the sand wash away from underneath it. So one of my jobs has been to investigate that and to try and map that efficiently and work out when they need to go out with equipment and do something to prop up the pipeline so it doesn't sag. And then on the left there, you can see the Port of Melbourne. So I've done a lot of work in the Port of Melbourne. I worked as a construction engineer when they were upgrading one of the docks there. So that meant making a lot of noise to drive piles into the ground. And then later on, I got my real job. And one of the big things that I did at that job was what we call due diligence. So when there's something like a port that the government is selling or they're going to lease out, the people who are interested in saying, yes, I want that, I want to be the group to run the port, they get a chance to go and look at it and learn about it and work out how much they're willing to pay. So kind of like if you're shopping for fruits and vegetables, you're looking at them all and working out which ones are bruised and which ones aren't, and you're like, oh, this probably will last 2 more days, or this is going to last for the next week. And you're doing a similar thing with a port, except it's much bigger and you don't have the choice of picking a different apple. You're just trying to work out how long the one you've got is going to last. So I spent a lot of time doing that and also planning what the port might look like in the future. So there's a few things that are really important there. One, we looked at the economics of everything from how much grain Australia is producing and how easy it is to get it along rail from farms to the port to then put on ships, and this is where climate change comes into this, to how many days in the next 20 years the waves in that area are going to be so big that we can't actually use the port for what it's designed for. So the ships can't be there and be unloaded safely. And we can actually model that and count that and say, actually, because of climate change, that means we're going to get more storms and bigger storms. And that means the water is going to come up over the edge of the port much more often. So that's one real application of understanding climate change today. Yeah. And I've also done a bunch of work now investigating dams and reservoirs. So reservoirs are like the lake behind a dam. So like you can see, this one here is not one that I've worked on, but it's one that I've visited. This is Lake Mead, the very, 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 very big dam in the USA. And so from that perspective, we're interested in how much water can fit behind that dam wall. And we use dams for a couple of things. We use them to store water that we want to drink and we want to use for agriculture. And we also often have a section of water storage that we leave empty in case it floods. So all the flood waters can be caught there and then gradually released. So downstream of the dam, you don't have people's houses actually flooding. And so that means that on a regular day, we intentionally leave part of the volume that we could fit water in empty. And again, as our climates change, it means the timing of the rain is changing slightly every year. And this means that at times where we'd leave more space for water that we're going to drink, so actually having water in that, we have to reduce that volume to accommodate a larger floodwater volume. And at the end of the day, we can't actually store as much water in the dam as we used to if we want to be just as well protected from floods as we are right now. So we're working to develop better methods to really intelligently decide how much of each volume we're going to need. So that's one job that we do. Okay. So how do I do all these things? Well, I use robotic and autonomous technology. So there's a couple of pieces here. So there's sort of three main things that I use, and one of them is my favorite and that I do the most of. So we use autonomous underwater vehicles. So that's the one on the left there. They kind of look like a submarine that doesn't have any people in it so I send it a set of instructions and then we throw it in the water and then it does what I told it, hopefully. And then it comes back and it calls a phone to tell us where it is, and then we go and pick it up. These ones are propelled with a propeller, kind of like a submarine. And yes, they do look a lot like a torpedo. This particular one is relatively small. It's about not quite a foot round and maybe 8 feet long. And then we also have another version of this, which is my favorite, my baby. You can see the funny photo of me being very confused at how to work a GoPro down the bottom there. In the background, there's my autonomous underwater glider. And that's my favorite, so I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then we also have this other class of vehicles called ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. So these ones, you can see on the right, there's a bunch of different ones. So they vary from the size of kind of a vacuum cleaner all the way up to something that would take up a whole shipping container. So I've done a lot of work with the smaller ones, and the smaller ones are controlled with something that is in fact sometimes exactly an Xbox controller. So they come through a computer and you have your controller plugged in and you can move around and go up and down and grab things. And that's one of the ways that we look at those pipelines that I mentioned earlier. And I've also built a few of these from scratch. And I say from scratch, but it's kind of like big kid Lego or IKEA furniture. So they send you a kit and then you put it together by following the instructions. And that's what I'm doing up on the right there. And the one that I built is in the very blue photo. The much bigger ones need more of a control center. So the photo of me up in the middle there is me sitting in one of those control centers on a big ship that I will show you later. Yes. So, and down the bottom left there is a sonar image. So using the autonomous underwater vehicle above it, we were able to map that pipeline that I showed you. And you could see that it was sitting above the seabed, and right in the middle of that picture there, that's what we're seeing there. So we use sound to see it, to see the seabed here, because it can be very dark down in deep water, so pictures aren't so helpful always. Yeah.
Later. No. I mean, I need to do something later. Yeah, okay.
Hi, sorry.
All right.
Thank you.
So then we're so I've done some work on drowned coral reefs in Hawaii. So that's again where we're mapping the seabed with one of these autonomous underwater vehicles. So why are we interested in drowned coral reefs? So you guys might know that coral likes to live pretty close to the sun because it needs the sunlight to do its thing. And then, so during the last ice age, sea levels rose a lot. And when the sea levels rose, they drowned the reefs. So the reefs died because it got too deep for them. There was too much water for the light to go through, and not enough light reached the reef, the coral, and they died. And what we can do is we can, if we take a sample of that coral with one of those remotely operated vehicles, we can bring that back to the surface, and we can work out the age of that piece of coral, and we know the water depth, and from that we can get an idea of what the sea level on Earth looked like in the past. And one of the reasons that we're really interested in doing this is because depending on which ice melts first, the sea levels around the world will look very different. They're not all going to raise up like the water in a bathtub. Actually, they could be tilted because water is really, really heavy if you have enough of it. And that means it can actually warp the Earth's crust. So if Greenland melts faster than Antarctica, the sea levels will look very different than if Antarctica melts first. So one of the things scientists are trying to work out is what happened in the past and how different those things could be. So how much does this actually matter to us? And if we can work out how much it matters, then can we measure the relative sea level ice melting in Greenland and Antarctica to work out what the Earth will look like in the future. And when I say in the future, I mean like the next 50 to 100 years and further in the future than that. But that's pretty important if you're designing something that's going to be around for the next 100 years. So this is something that engineers are interested in. So what we did is we went out on this big research ship and we took with us one of these autonomous underwater vehicles, the ones that are sort of like a submarine with a propeller that do the mapping. And we use sound to take images of the seabed to work out where the best place to go back with one of these remotely operated vehicles up on the right is, and go and take samples of the coral. So it's often the way that these autonomous underwater vehicles are a tool to help us work out where we want to go back to. They're a reconnaissance tool. And they're very useful at that. They can do that a lot quicker than a ship can do it and with a much higher accuracy. All right, so ice melting in Antarctica. Whoa. So I mentioned this before, and I'm going to tell you a bit about a trip that I went on in last January. So last year, well, actually, it was the year before because it was just before Christmas. I got on this really big red ship. It's a Korean icebreaker called the Araon. And I took my autonomous underwater glider and we sailed down with the Korean Polar Institute down to Terra Nova Bay, which you can see here. So we left from New Zealand. You leave from New Zealand and you keep going south until you hit Antarctica and you end up at Terra Nova Bay. So Terra Nova Bay is a polynya, and that means it's an area that is usually free of sea ice. So that means we can sail around in it pretty easily. Of course, this is an icebreaker, so it can cut through, but it's pretty hard to run autonomous underwater vehicles in ice-covered environments. However, that was one of the reasons we went there, because we're trying to understand how fast this ice from the land is melting. So we're interested in these glaciers and ice shelves. So to really understand, we need to get underneath them, but they're really, really big. So these really big ones can be, we think this one was about 250 meters thick. So that's about 750 feet deep actually in the water. So it's much higher than that above the water, but underneath the water, it's very deep. So we went under there with my autonomous underwater robot, and this is where we went. And the whole point of that was to try and work out how that ice is melting. Where is the warm water coming from that's making it melt? So I took took my glider, and I have my team here, and I sent them off on a little boat off of the big boat to go and put it in the water. And I was on the top of the ship talking to them on radio and looking at them through binoculars and controlling our glider from the ship. So that's my job as the pilot, to do that. And in the middle here, you can see Jangbovia Station, which is the Korean base down there. And so what we worked out from this is we did send the glider underneath, under here. So we went under here, which was great. This is the first time anyone has ever done that, which is super cool. So one of the really awesome things I get to do as a scientist who does research is to find out things literally nobody knows, which is really cool. You get to be the first person to actually see something ever. No one ever has seen this, and has been there, done that. So that's really awesome. And it does take a lot of bravery though. So the chance that this would work, when we left, I thought it was about probably 60%. So if you toss a coin, just a little bit better than that what we were going to do was going to work. So that's pretty scary because the equipment that we have costs a lot of money, and also our reputation's on the line, so we want it to work, but it's high risk, high reward. So what we worked out from doing this is we measured the water under here, and we measure a few things. We measure the temperature of the water, how much salt is in the water, and from those things we can estimate how dense the water is. And the density helps us understand where it's coming from. So what I mean by that is, so sea ice forms out here, and when ice forms, all the salt in the water gets rejected, so brine. So all the salt comes out of it, and that makes the water really salty, and salty water is heavy and it sinks. And then we have this big current in the system, so we think that water is then being driven back underneath the ice where it's making it melt because it's warmer, and then this melt water is cooler, so all of those things mix together to come back out here. So understanding this is pretty important for just so we know what's going on in the system with the dynamics of it, but also because this is one of the things that is considered by large climate models. And so if we can go and say, this is what the values underneath this ice actually are, rather than guessing what they would be, we can then make a much better informed prediction about what's going to happen in the future all over the Earth. All right. And yes, there were lots and lots and lots of animals, and it was really cool. There was lots of seals and lots of penguins. And we also saw some orcas, which was lots of fun. Some pictures of us doing science there too, just for good measure. But we did have some biologists on board with us who were interested in the penguins, and we did some work around that too. And of course, we're studying the physics of the system, which governs the chemistry of the system, and the chemistry of the system is directly linked to the biology of the system. So the water has to have the right amount of oxygen in it, so that well, from the oxygen we can see what little algae has been photosynthesizing, and the algae then tells us about how many bigger things and bigger things and bigger things and bigger things are in the system, until you get up to leopard seals and whales. And we did have some people on the ship who were using acoustics, so using sound, to listen for whales and leopard seals. They're very noisy. So that was really cool to hear those sounds. And we're hoping when we go back next year to take those sensors and put them on our autonomous underwater vehicle so that we can get measurements from even more interesting places. And one thing that I can tell you is that underneath ice, it's very quiet, like acoustically. If you were down there and you could hear, there wouldn't be anything to hear. except if a large critter goes under there. The other thing that they listen for is ice quakes, so they're listening for the ice breaking apart, and that. So they have instruments that listen for a whole year, and then we go and pick them up. And so this year we will pick some up and drop some off and come back the next year, and that helps us again understand how fast the ice is melting. Yeah. Okay, so a big part of what I do, though, apart from all the cool big ship things, is some more small boat things. So we go and we do a bunch of work in lakes. So I focus on large lakes. So Lake Tahoe is my home lake. It's very close to Davis, and there is, it's very, very, very deep. So it's about, it's on average 300 meters deep. So 900 feet, which is very, very deep for a lake. And that's in fact deeper than most of the ocean that surrounds most countries. So that's pretty cool, which means a few things. One, there's really cool physics going on inside of it. And also it's a really great place to go out and test these autonomous underwater vehicles that I have, because it's really easy for me to get to really deep water. That's one of the things that we do. Here, most of these photos are from, these are all Lake Tahoe. This is in Lake Geneva in Switzerland. So we collected some data there as well. And what we can tell from this data is a few things. One of them is that lakes are getting warmer too. So we keep telling everyone that the planet is warming, and that's kind of helpful, but it's sort of hard to fully understand. But then when I tell you that the lake that I spend a lot of time in is getting warmer and I can draw a graph of it today, that's pretty crazy. So here is the depth average water temperature. So how we collect this data most of the time is, this is Lake Tahoe, and about every 10 days, somebody goes out to the middle of the lake, to this point here and this point here, and we drop an instrument down that measures the amount of salt in the water and the temperature of the water. We send it all the way to the bottom, and then we pull it all the way back up to the top. And then if we take the average of all of those measurements, we can come up with a depth average water temperature. And that's what we're seeing here. So we started doing that in 1969, so long before I was born and long before all of you were born. And since then, we can draw this lovely graph of it all, and we can see, and then we put an average line through that, and we can see that we've gone up considerably, over 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Which is huge. So it's happening. It's getting warmer. And why do we care that it's getting warmer is the other question that everyone has. The reason we call it climatic eutrophication, which is a really big fancy word that we created. Yes, scientists like creating words. And what that means is that because humans are changing the climate, we're changing the nutrient balance in the lake. Because water can store a different amount of oxygen depending on how warm it is. Warmer water can store more oxygen in it. And if there's more oxygen, there's more fuel for all of, for a different, the bottom level of the food chain to do their thing. So we can have many more algae blooms, which is really important for drinking water. And swimming as well. So you can't swim in a lake when there's an algae bloom. And it also means that treating the water for you to drink is a lot harder. So almost every lake, we use it for drinking water. This lake we do, most that you would experience, you would as well. So that's why this is particularly important. So that's kind of temperature in general. But what I'm most interested in right now is, is a thing called an internal wave. So I talked about how I'm interested in water mixing. So an internal wave happens when you've got a warm top layer of a big lake and a cool bottom layer, and then the wind blows along the top, which means the top layer moves more, and then you get this wave that propagates along the interface between the warm water and the cool water. So some of you might have found that thing that we call a thermocline, the place where the warm top layer and the cool bottom layer meet if you've been swimming in the lake, usually only if you're in a cooler place. So I'm not sure if you would have all experienced it, but some of you might have. If you float on the surface of the water, it's really warm, and then you dive down, you might find it to be cold down there. So these waves start and they're huge. So, and you can see here the water is mixing, so we're seeing a lot more yellow happening in there where we were just once red and blue. And as they're moving around, so there's a lot of water velocity moving, so that means that on the edges there, which would be our lake bottom or our ocean bottom, these also happen in the ocean, we get a lot of sediment that gets moved around. And that's the thing that I'm particularly interested in. I want to know how that sediment's being moved. And one reason why I decided to come and study is because I started looking into this, and no one could answer the question. There was no answer to the question, how in deep water is all of the sediment moving around? And this is the best theory that we have, is that these really big waves are moving that sediment around, which is causing erosion around really deep structures. And it's also really important for all of the nutrients that come out of the sediment in the ocean, and also heat. A lot of heat comes straight from the bottom, and this is one way that it gets moved around. So that's what I'm focusing on right now. All right, so I'm up to the point where I'm going to ask you all if you have any questions.
It's kind of irrelevant. It's kind of irrelevant, but have you ever been to the Great Barrier Reef?
Yes, I have been. I was about 5 years old.
Oh, okay.
But I do go diving south of there, and my hometown's a fair bit south from there, but we still have a really, really important reef ecosystem there. And one of the things that I like most about doing that and having my own home reef is that I keep going back through different seasons, and you can see how when the water temperature changes, you have different animals living there on the reef. And that's really unique. And that's another thing that's happening as we have climate change moving around the water, and how the water is moving because it's warmer. Where that's affecting all of those creatures that usually live on a reef. Where are they going to go?
Okay. I was wondering, because you talked about you model how many waves, or like how high the waves will be, and how many of them will hit the port. How exactly do you model that? Do you use the drones for that? Or?
Okay. So this is a pretty good question, actually. So I'm interested in these internal waves, which you usually can't see because they're happening in the water. So what we do is we measure temperature, and in the temperature signal, we can see the wave shape coming out of that. So So from the very beginning of this, we've got, if this was temperature, we'd have warm water up here and cool water down the bottom. And that's exactly what we're seeing move here. But again, can we actually model it? That's a great question. And we kind of can. This is a very simple version of a model here. And what we can do is do this on a really large scale, but these waves can have wave heights. So in the South China Sea, we've measured wave heights of internal waves of between 200 and 400 meters, which is huge. And then I'm interested in how those really, really, really big waves are interacting with really, really, really tiny grains of sediment. And when you get into modeling things like that, having something so big affect something so small, and to be able to get that right is really hard. And it means that we need a really, really fine grid. So what we do when we model anything is we create a grid over the whole thing. But because I'm interested in something so small, I need such a really, really tiny grid, which means there's so many points at which the calculations must be performed that it's actually currently not possible to run a model that considers all that over a time frame that's actually useful to us. So I could model about 2 seconds of time, and that would take months and months and months for a big supercomputer to do the calculations on. So this is one of the few problems where it still makes a lot of sense for us to actually go out and measure it, and try and understand from field data what's happening. And you run into a similar problem if you were to try and bring this problem into a laboratory and have some kind of experimental setup. You still have to then somehow make your wave small and your sediment small. And eventually, if you make your sand grains small enough, they stop acting like sand, and they start acting like electrically charged particles, and then you run into a lot of problems. So yeah, great question, John.
Since you have so much work at the science lab, do you have any time for diving or any sports in the water?
Yeah, I do have some time for those. Often my time's kind of in blocks. So when I went out on the big research trip, I was gone for over a month. I got to stand on land for 1 day in 41 days. I had 1 day to stand on land, which is kind of crazy. But then when we got back to New Zealand, we spent 10 days going around and having fun. And one of the things that I did is I went whitewater rafting, and then I went scuba diving. And so I do a lot of those. And I think it's important for us to do. And here at UC Davis, we still have to do learning, like actual classwork. So I still have teachers who teach me things. And one of the classes that I took, the field trip for the class was to go and raft down the Grand Canyon. So we spent 3 weeks going down the Grand Canyon on a raft, and that was fantastic. So like I said, there's usually blocks of time where you do lots of fun things, and then lots of work, and then lots of fun things.
What's the most favorite place you've been to so far?
Ooh, good question. So I've actually visited every continent, and a bunch of places in between. So I love New Zealand. It's where I like going back to. I'm not from New Zealand, I'm from Australia. I now have a bunch of friends in New Zealand though, because I go through there a bunch. And there's so much to do in New Zealand. And also New Zealand does really cool science. So one thing that you get to do when you have my job is you get to kind of go on a tour, and you sort of just invite yourself places. So you say, oh, I'm going to go and give a talk at this place. And you also just pick the place off the list that you want to go. And you're like, yeah, you know what? There's a conference on in Vancouver this year, and I really want to go to Vancouver. So it's really important I go to this conference, isn't it? And that's what we do. Certainly the conferences that are in the fun places generally have better attendance. So a conference is where we all get together and go and talk about the same thing and sort of nerd out about science for a little while in our small science bubbles. So sometimes they're huge, like there's one that happens in San Francisco every year. It happens in San Francisco every year because it's so big, there's no other place that can fit that many people. There's like 25,000 people that go, and that's huge. And then there's one that I like going to that has about 50 people that attend, and during the time that I'm there, I get to meet every single person, which is fantastic. But it's also really scary because all of the people are there who like wrote the textbooks that are sitting on my desk. I actually get to meet them, and they also are there judging my research and giving me advice. Usually most people are pretty good about being nice and trying to build you up and give you constructive criticism.
Did you guys want to invite her to Myanmar?
Yes.
That would be very cool. Oh, I have a question for all of you actually about Myanmar. Do you use the metric system?
Yes.
No.
In some places, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you learn in school in the metric system or do you learn in feet and inches?
We learn in the metric system.
Oh,
We use the metric.
Okay. Okay.
Miss Jasmine, is it okay if we go to grid view so you can see everybody?
Absolutely.
Okay. Guys, if you know, up in the top right corner, if you click gallery view, then you can see everybody who's here. Okay. Good. Okay. So the answer was we use the metric system most of the time. Mhm.
Nice. So the US still does not use the metric system most of the time, except for science. So we often talk in both, which is kind of tricky. And also, if you're an engineer, often you'll work in both because although science happens in metric, engineering still doesn't because many things are manufactured in feet and inches, here in particular. Which is kind of tricky. So we do have to learn both here if you're going to be an engineer and be successful.
They could just step down and take a break.
Any other questions?
They're thinking, I'm sure. Oh,
Hi, can I ask a
hand
question?
here. Zway Miat, go ahead. You got to unmute your microphone. Anybody else?
Can
Any
I ask a
questions?
question?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
If your audio isn't working, feel free to type it in the chat and we can read it.
Was that Bridget?
Yeah, could you hear me? Sorry, my
Now we
internet's
can.
really bad.
Now we can hear you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I ask again?
Go
Okay.
for it.
Sure.
Are icebergs more affected by sea temperatures or surface temperatures?
Ooh, that is a good question. What's driving the melting of them? So they have much more mass below the surface. So it's the sea temperature that will be melting most of them. So you've probably all seen those little pictures of the ice. It's like it's just the tip of the iceberg because that's all you can see. Well, that's what they're actually like. So the sea temperature, I would say. And certainly we see that as they start drifting away from and drifting north, then we start seeing them melt much more. But that's for an iceberg. Certainly the sea ice that's floating on the top is probably much more affected by the surface temperatures because it's not very deep. So the stuff like in my background right now, the stuff you can see is maybe 1 or 2 meters thick. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
All right, guys, the window is kind of starting to close. So think about your questions. We only have about 10 minutes left. So we don't have an ocean engineer with us every day of the year. So this is your chance.
About how many times have you used the little controller things that you move the rover thing with?
Oh, okay. So there was 2 different kinds there. So we have the ones that are like permanently cabled in and you control in real time with the controller, like an Xbox controller. Actually, people who play video games tend to be very, very good at operating them because it's the same kind of spatial awareness as like operating in a space, but just seeing what you see on a screen, which you probably noticed is really different to what you can see with your eyes. So those ones, I don't use them to do science much at all anymore. Mostly I use them to do outreach, talking to people like you. If I could have you in my lab, I'd bring one out and let you guys control it. And also school teachers like Mr. Davis, we get them to come in and build them with us, so that then they can go away with some science skills for their classes. But I mostly use the ones that are autonomous, which means I send them instructions and they hopefully complete the instructions and then come back. So that's kind of tricky because you've got to try and plan for all of the things that could go wrong in your instructions. Some of them are kind of smarter than others. We're seeing someone scream.
Yeah, somebody accidentally, I'm gonna fix that there. Okay.
Um,
That was a cool screen, by the way. Anyway, all right. Yep,
Excuse me.
go ahead.
How long does it take you to build the thingy that go underwater?
So the ones that I've built, it usually takes, I can build one in an afternoon if I have the right help. But so they're the ones that are small and about the size of a vacuum cleaner, and then the remotely operated ones. And that's assuming that I have all the things that I need to build it. And they usually come like in a kit, kind of like your Lego does. And then there's the other ones, the big long yellow ones. I don't build them. They come built from somebody and I get them and then I use them. But to do that, one of the tricky things we have to do is make them float. So that's a big part of my job, is making stuff float. So I spend a lot of time putting weights in them and taking weights out so that they're the perfect amount of heavy and light, so that they float when we want them to float and sink when we want them to sink, so that they can go all the way down as far as we want, but still have enough buoyancy, so floaty force, to come back to the surface and float there by themselves. So I do spend a lot of time having them open and closed and open and closed. And then the other challenging part of my job is when we get a new sensor. So I talked about measuring the amount of salt in the water and the water temperature, but we also measure a bunch of other things. So we measure, so that comes through one particular sensor, and then we have another sensor that measures dissolved oxygen, so how much oxygen is in the water. And then we have another sensor that measures the amount of chlorophyll that's in the water. So it uses a fluorescent light and that sends it out and it reads the amount of light that comes back. And from that, we can estimate the amount of chlorophylls, which correlates to how much green stuff is in the water, which usually means it's live. And then we have another sensor that measures how many particles there are in the water. We have another one that measures temperature really, really fast and shear force, like this force. And so to get all of those, something new comes and I have to make it work. So it's kind of like you plug it in, but then you also have to plug it into the circuit board and then plug that into another circuit board and make sure that everything goes the way it's supposed to. And then you also have to send it a new bit of code to tell your robot that it has this new thing and what to do with it. So that's often not as easy as it sounds. I often work with the people who make them for the first time. So that's exciting, but can some days be very frustrating as well when things don't work and you don't know why. You have to work it out. So that's one of the things I do.
Good question. Sophie, you have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You mentioned a lot of reasons of why your job is really interesting, but if you had to choose one thing that would be the favorite thing of your job, what would it be?
Definitely getting to go places and discover things that no one else has ever done before.
How many robots have you built?
I have built 3 from scratch, but I consider myself to be the robot mom of 2.
You said that like some of the people like if they play video game they're good at controlling things. Do you play video games?
I do sometimes. It was a long time before since I have, but now that everyone's stuck inside, I am playing video games again. Skyrim is my current favorite. I also played a lot of Mario Kart. That was fun.
There's a question that was typed into the, can you see that question there?
Yeah,
I can read it out to you if you want.
Oh no, I can read it, it's all right. As you were speaking about ice sheets in Antarctica, you also mentioned glaciers. Have you actually done any research yourself on the melting of the glaciers over the last years? Yes, I have. So they are melting, but they're also, so in Antarctica, this is specific to the glacier that I've worked on. So the Drygalski ice tongue in my map there. So an ice tongue is when a glacier comes off the land and goes out into the water, and then we call it a tongue. So if you stick your tongue out, it kind of looks like that. So that one, we had a team on top measuring how thick it was in different places. And we're measuring the melting from the bottom. So we think that the amount that it's growing at this particular point in time last year was about equivalent to the amount that it was melting and breaking apart. So that one seems fairly stable from that perspective. The Swiss glaciers, I'm not sure about because most of them are land-based. I'm not sure if any of them, there's certainly no ocean around Switzerland. I don't think any run into Lake Geneva directly. They do melt though, and the meltwater comes down to fill the lake there.
Guys, we have about 5 minutes left. So if you have any questions, this is this is your chance to ask. Okay. Go ahead, you can just unmute yourself and ask if you'd like.
I have a question.
Yep, Rose?
Like, what is the most challenging thing you have done so far?
Ooh, that's tricky. Well, moving to a different country was really hard, and I know some of you have probably done that. That's really tough, especially like I did it all by myself without my family. So that was really hard because I moved here and I had to make new friends and work out how to do everything from mail a letter to pay my taxes. So that was pretty rough because I needed to make a lot of friends who could tell me how to do all those things. They're not really things that you can Google some of them, but it's not always quite that easy to learn how life works in a new place. So that's hard. So that's like that kind of hard. But then the other kind of hard, I guess, is like in terms of my job and the actual like technically difficult was certainly what we were doing down in Antarctica, where we were operating these autonomous underwater vehicles around all these floating pieces of ice. And we're really concerned that they're going to get stuck underneath the ice, and then what do you do? So we spent a lot of time planning, trying to be organized so that if they did get stuck under the ice, they'd have some way to get themselves back out. And we're still developing that kind of technology, so that will help reduce the risk of the missions that we're running. And also while we're down there, things change so quickly, and you're on a ship that barely has any internet, so you don't get to Google anything. You have to already know. So that's kind of really tough. Also, you can't call and get supplies for anything. So we broke one of our part of our robot, which something always goes wrong on one of these missions. That's normal, and part of your job is to problem solve. So we broke a piece, and then we had to work out how to fix it. And we ended up working with the ship's engineer, who made us a spare part for our robot out of a piece of a pen. That's what we were doing, because that's all we had. And it was a really cool experience as well to work with the crew on that ship, because they all only spoke Korean and we only spoke English, and we had sort of a couple, the chief scientist, who's like our boss and talks with the crew. She was fantastic and she spoke great English, but we definitely like working with people from all those different cultures and language places is tricky. Yeah, especially because when you're working down there, you work 24 hours a day. So I would go to sleep and someone would wake me up 2 hours later to go do something. And then I'd go to sleep again and someone would wake me up 2 hours later to do something. So it was tough being in that situation with not much sleep. But luckily my glider co-pilot definitely helped me get through that and not make any mistakes that would have meant we lost something. So that was great. We would recommend having a co-pilot.
I have a question.
Yep.
How do you control the robot?
Oh, okay. So the one that I mostly use is autonomous, which means I don't actually get to control it in real time. I send it some instructions, so a piece of code that it then runs. And then hopefully it comes back where I expect it to. It doesn't always. Sometimes strange things happen. Sometimes I make a mistake in my code, so I might have a typo in there. There's a few times where I've tried to send it to Africa unsuccessfully. It usually runs into the side of a lake. But on a couple of those times where we've made a mistake, we've actually discovered something that we didn't know that we were going to find. So sometimes you get to do some surprise science because something doesn't go quite to plan, which is exciting.
Okay, guys, this is nearing the end of our presentation today. I want to say thank you very much to Miss Jasmin for joining us nearly to become a PhD. We're just hearing the science and thinking about a lot of the things that you talked about, the physics and the chemistry and the biology, how they come together, and you guys work together to see how everything's interrelated and interconnected is amazing. And your understanding of how the ocean's temperature impacts the ice, and being able to see the temperature changes in the lakes, and all of these things are all evidence that you're collecting that help us create a picture of, and I think as you pointed out, of the future. We're starting to map out what things will look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and how we can make them the best they can be. We'll learn from that how we can change things and improve things so that the outcome is the best it can be. And that's what a scientist really does. And it's such an amazing, and I loved how you said you answer questions that nobody knows the answer to. And you go places where no one goes and no one has ever seen before. That to me is exciting work, being a scientist. It's wonderful. So really, really happy to have you along with us. I'll leave it to you. Any last words that you'd like to say? And if anyone else wants to say anything, last words, and then we'll conclude then.
Just thank you guys for having me and listening and asking some great questions there. I can see you guys are thinking a lot about this, and I hope that some of you feel like if science is your thing, you can do it no matter who you are or where you're from or where you want to go with it.
All right. Very inspiring. Thank you. Anyone have any last things they would like to say? Okay. Cool.
Thank you.
That was a nice thing to say. Thank you. Good. And I'm sure everyone in the audience wants to say that. I'm sure you're all, if you want to say thank you, just put a thumb up. Yep. Say everyone's saying thank you very much right now for doing that. And people are typing in the chat window too. So, cool. Oh, somebody actually, oh wow, look at you guys figured out how to put real thumbs up on your screens. I didn't know you could do that. That's so cool. All right. All right, good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Wow, what an amazing session that we had with you. We learned so much. And thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Good. All right,
Best
guys.
of luck with staying inside, everyone.
Yeah, we're all in the inside for a little while. Yep. So you guys can sign off when you want. I'll stay on for a few minutes. And if anyone has any last minute questions, you can stay on and you can ask those if you feel like it. But I'll keep it on for a couple more minutes.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, Sophie.
Bye.
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 Bye, guys. Thanks for joining us today. What a great audience today.
I
Bye.
was wondering,
Yeah,
what,
go ahead.
like if in high school, what classes did you take? Because we have to choose between physics and chemistry and biology. So like, because I know that marine is more about biology, but then maybe constructing the robots is more about physics. So
Yeah, so I took chemistry and physics and high level math. So, but I also don't know what your chemistry and what your physics looks like. So I think I actually learned more physics in my math class than I learned in my physics class. So, I mean, that's something for you to decide if you have to pick between them, which is better for you. And also like, and I recommend this to people here as well. If you get to pick, and one of the things you get to choose between is what teacher you have, and you know that you like one better than the other, oftentimes you'll learn better from someone that you feel like you fit well with, which might be beneficial to you. You need to think about that too. The other thing is if you know that you're that you want to do something particular at university and and it's going to rely more heavily on one or the other of those things, it's generally useful to do that subject so that when you get there you're not feeling kind of behind. But again, and above all, do what you're passionate about. If you really love chemistry over physics but you think you should be doing physics, you should be doing chemistry.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other last minute questions? Anyone want to say anything before we go? Okay. Michael? Okay. Good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine. It was great. Really, I'm new to this whole Zoom thing, doing the Zoom conferences. This is my second one I've ever kind of been involved with organizing, and I feel like this went very well. How do you feel about it so far?
Oh yeah, definitely it went well. I mean, I definitely have the advantage of I teach over Zoom too, so like I know how it works and I can find my pointer and get the right screen being shared and stuff. But I generally find it's fairly intuitive, although they do keep adding features that make it a little bit more tricky. But obviously your students have worked it out, so they're fine.
Yeah, they're pretty good with it. The kids are not the problem. It's the adults that we're the ones that are always fumbling our ways through this stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Wow. Yeah, that was great. Todd, thanks for having me and for using the Skype a Scientist thing. That's great. Great to see people.
Yeah, that was so easy actually. I sent it and then like 2 days later we were connected, and I looked at it, we got up to 84 participants.
Really?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I was pretty impressed with that. I was afraid to invite you because I didn't want to make you feel bad because there's nobody showing up, but fortunately 84 people showed up, so something went right.
Yeah. Sometimes it suits people, sometimes it doesn't. It's fine. No, I think that's the new normal now. No one will be offended if people don't show up. Everyone's got a lot going on.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I was really, that was so easy, and I'll definitely use that again. So how I've never even, how did you connect through that? Is that through?
So I signed up on, I think I got a Google form thing that I filled in. So one of the scientists that I follow on Twitter is one of the organizers, and she was like, sign up for Skype a Scientist. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. I do a fair bit of outreach work. So for me, it's like a progression on that, which is good.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. It's so good for our kids. We had 5th graders up to 10th graders in there. And for them just to see you, I actually specifically requested a female scientist. I don't know, just because I thought, wow, that would be awesome for our girls to see what you can do. And that was also, I was just so glad that it was you. So, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely makes a difference to them. I do a lot of work with the Society for Women in Engineering, and that's one of the things that we really try and do is just like make it visible. It's tricky to aspire to be something that you've never seen someone like you be.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a bonus. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm really grateful for that. Yeah, very interesting. I'm an engineer by background, so I kind of speak the same language, sort of. It's been a long time. I did also have a real job as an environmental engineer once upon a time.
Who needs those real jobs?
Yeah. Yeah, I prefer teaching in the educational world. It's great.
Yeah.
So, well, really cool. So yeah, and I kept thinking about the Xbox connection. I think you hit the nail on the head with probably like 50 of those kids right there. You know, the fact that you can use these controllers and drive things, that I probably loved hearing that.
Yeah, and I think it's important for some of those kids to know that those skills that they're doing can be useful for something if they really love it. Like they can do that.
Well, they're always getting in trouble for it. You know, get off your Xbox, get off the. But then for them to hear that for once in their life, oh, that could actually come in handy later on. They probably liked that.
Yeah. I'm sure someone's mom will be like, "Gosh, why did she say that?"
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, good. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome. All right, I might sign off now. It's getting late here.
All right. Yeah, I bet it is. Thanks for staying up late for us too.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care. Good to meet you, Jasmine.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.